Before we can start building our app, we'll need to learn about another important concept, and that concept is called components. In Vue.js, components are basically self-contained units of code. They can have their own templates and their own functionality. Basically, they're a predefined Vue object with its own options and templates and styles. Okay, so what does that actually mean? Let's take a look. There's a pretty cool image over here on Vue website. It's under here. Yep. Let's see it a bit bigger. Okay. So with components, basically I can create independent units of my app, and then I can wire them together in any way that I like to create an entire pages. I can repeat some functionalities easily, all that I have to do is to just reference the component that I want, and so on. Okay, that might sound kind of confusing, but once you see it in action, it's actually pretty simple, and it makes perfect sense. Also, components are very useful when building medium and large scale applications, which is what we want to do, because they separate your code, they make it maintainable and easier to read. Instead of having huge files with thousands of lines of code, you separate your code into simple, smaller blocks, building blocks that you can order and arrange in any way that you'd like. Okay, so in order to understand it better, we are going to build our first component. Now, let's say I'd like to convert my existing app, if I can even call it an app, into a component. How am I going to do that? Well, it's actually pretty simple once again. I'm going to delete this and this over here. So we just have our Vue active on our div, and I'll write my first component. I can do it like this. Vue component, this is the syntax. Over here I'm specifying the name of my component. I'll call it hello world. And here I can define some things. Basically, most of the things that I define here are going to be almost exactly the same like the ones that you can define on a Vue instance. And it's even written over here in the docs, if you see. A component is essentially a Vue instance with predefined options, and that's a really well way to put it. Okay, so let's add the template. I'm going to write it like this. Okay, let's grab this from over here. I'm going to add these guys for new lines, and I'll wrap it in a div. And here. And this is it. Actually, and I'd really like to point out that we will not be writing our HTML in JavaScript strings like this, like some peasants. Do not worry. This is just temporary. We will learn later the better way to do it, but for now it's okay because the HTML is still pretty simple. Okay, so let's give our component some data. I'm going to write it like this. You'll notice that it's slightly different than the way we wrote it here when I defined it for my Vue instance. Here, when writing it for a component, it needs to be a function that returns your data as an object. Like this. If you're interested why is that, why it has to be that way, you might want to read up over here on Vue.js website under guide. There's this subtitle here, data must be a function. Otherwise, you can just remember it that this is the way that you have to write it when specifying it for a component. Okay, so my component is pretty much ready. All I have to do is to insert it into HTML now. How do I do that? Well, all I have to do is write hello world over here, like this, because I named it hello world and I can call it like this, like a custom HTML element. Let's see how this works. Okay, everything appears to be in order. My two-way data binding is working. I can see the value of name that I enter in my input, and that's pretty much it. Okay, so let's recap. We just wrote a simple component, we gave it a template, and we gave it some data over here. We defined our name property of the data, and we inserted the component in our HTML. Let's look at the cool things that I can do now. Well, first of all, I can simply insert another Hello World component in my page, and I'll have two of them that are working completely independently. Now, suppose I want to add a title over here with h1 tags, h1, and I'm going to call it title, simply put. Let's refresh. Okay, great. But what if I want to call the first component, the title over here, I want to show something different than the thing over here? What's the best way to do that? Well, let's learn about props or properties. I can define a prop of my component like this. Title. Its type will be a string, and its default value will be title. And I can simply show it in my template the same way that I show data, with curly brackets. Title. Yep, I forgot the comma here. Common mistake. Yep, and it appears to be working. Now, you might be wondering, why is this different than the data thing? It does exactly the same. Well, take a look at this, what I can do now. I'm going to specify a title over here. Let's call it component 1. And boom, it has now its own custom title. And I can do the same for this one over here. Component 2. There it is. Pretty cool, huh? So with properties, I can specify some custom data in my HTML. I can pass data from here, and I can easily customize the template of my components. That's the best way to make them reusable. Okay, moving on. Let's say I'd like to add a button over here. Button. That's going to say greet me. Okay, awesome. And when I click on this button, I want an alert to pop up with my name. So how can I do that? Let's learn about methods. I can define all kinds of methods in my Vue components that can be used either in templates or in my code. For example, I'm going to create a greet function. So methods are just an object that contains your functions that can be used in your component. And let's say alert show hello plus my name. Okay, so now I have my greet function, but how do I actually trigger it on this button on click? Well, it's pretty simple with Vue. This is the correct syntax. Actually, you can see that. We on click, greet, and that's all there is. Let's test it out. Let's write John here. Greet me. Hello, John. It appears to be working, and you see this. The second component, it's completely independent. If I click this button, it won't show anything because the name is currently empty. But if I enter something else over here, it's going to show that value over here. Okay, so we learned some basics about components. That was important for us because our app, Beeper, is actually going to be composed entirely out of components. Every single thing that we write is going to be a component actually behind the scenes. And the coolest thing is that we actually saw all the major parts that make a component. Pretty much every single one of our components is going to have a template, it's going to have some data, and it's going to have some ways to manipulate that data or methods, as we saw.